Hi, welcome to episode 9 of the Ukulele Sessions. We've got something a little bit different and a little bit special today. Today I'm doing an interview with Jim Beloff. Now, if you don't know who Jim is, you should. If you play the ukulele, I guarantee, even if you don't know it, Jim will have influenced your playing. Now, Jim runs a company called Flea Music, and they are responsible for some of the most influential books out there. Let me show you a few of the books that Flea Market are responsible for. Firstly, John King's Classical Ukulele. If you play classical ukulele, you'll know this book. It was the first book, incredibly influential, fantastic playing by a fantastic gentleman. Was one of the first books to address it. Well, it was the first book to address classical playing in a campanella style. Very, very influential book. Jim's company, Flea Market Music, also put out books by Lyle Ritz. To my mind, one of the best jazz players in the world. I'm completely obsessed with listening to Lyle Ritz's playing, and we discuss Lyle quite a lot in the interview. Jim's company also puts out books by Tony Mizen. He's put out, I think, 3 by Tony, including the very influential From Lute to Uke. Now, Jim started the company off with Jumpin' Jim's Ukulele Faves. He then put out several songbooks which sold really, really well. And then he did a visual history of the ukulele. Now, that was a book that George Harrison liked so much he used to give it out for Christmas presents. George Harrison then wrote a foreword to one of Jim's books. As a singer-songwriter, Jim has released his own albums, which are great. Jim's Dog's Got Fleas is especially one of my favourites. He's also written with Lyle Ritz and with Herb Otter as well. Jim also produced the album No Frills by Lyle Ritz. Jim has also written 2 ukulele concertos. The more observant of you may have noticed at the beginning the bit of music was different. I normally play over the beginning title sequences a piece called Canarios by Gaspar Sanz and played by myself. It's been replaced today by Dovetail, written by Jim. And Jim's very kindly let me put the whole piece at the end of the interview. The Dovetail and the other concerto, You Can't Be Serious, are both available on CD from Jim's website, which is fleamarketmusic.com. It's a fascinating interview. I genuinely could have chatted to Jim all day. Like I say, he's extremely influential. Most of you out there will have heard of Jim's name. If you haven't, I guarantee that what he's done and what he's achieved in the ukulele world will have influenced you. It's a fascinating chat that we have. I could have just gone on all day with him. So I really hope you enjoy this. Please do check out Jim's website as well. Okay, bye now. Hi Jim, lovely to see you. I wonder if you could start just by telling us a little bit about how you got interested in playing the ukulele.
Well, sure. Well, first of all, good morning, Paul. I know it's afternoon over there, but it's a pleasure to join you in your soundproofed room, it looks like.
My prison.
Goodness. The way it all started actually is courtesy of my father-in-law. Liz's dad was a Seabee during World War II, and on his way out to the Pacific, he stopped in San Francisco and I guess on a whim went to a pawn, not a porn, a pawn shop, and found an old ukulele, and I guess on a whim thought that he'd take it with him, and while he was away, he not only learned to play it, but he learned to play it well enough that he entertained others, and so just around the time that Liz and I were I was going to be transferred. I was working for Billboard magazine, which over here is a music trade newspaper. Yeah. Billboard is famous for its charts, its music charts. Okay. And so I was working for Billboard in New York City, and they wanted me to head out to the West Coast, to the LA office. And just before we left, I learned that Liz's dad played the ukulele. I don't think it had really come up before. And he played a few tunes, and he played it so well that I thought, I sort of filed this thought in the back of my head that if I ever found a good uke, I'd buy one.
Right.
At the time, I was completely in love with the guitar. I'd been playing it for what seemed like forever. All of my heroes were sort of singers, songwriter, guitarists. And I played a Martin guitar and wrote my own songs. And so anyway, we moved to California. And the other thing was that we are big flea market fans. I don't know if you call them that over there, but anyway, what do you call it?
Car boot sales, we call them.
Oh, car boot sales. Got it. Well, yeah. And so because Los Angeles is so blessed with great weather, you can pretty much guarantee that every Sunday there will be a very successful and well-attended flea market somewhere in the area. One of the best known is the Rose Bowl flea market in Pasadena. And so we'd been out in LA for probably 2 or 3 weeks when we heard about this. We love flea markets. We went, and there on a blanket was a Martin tenor ukulele from the 50s. And so I remembered that I had made this, sort of commitment to myself that if I found a good one, I'd buy it. And I didn't have the money, but Liz had a checkbook. And I think at the time, this was in 1991, I paid $250 for a Martin tenor uke. And well, I like to tell people now, be careful what you buy at flea markets or car boot sales, because it can change your life. And it certainly did ours.
Yeah, what a fantastic story. I'm sure you could put a 0 and times it by 3 on that, Martin, now, but good investment in many ways. So after that, you then started Flea Market Music, the publishing company, and I'm really looking forward to talking about this because I have a great interest in the company. When you first set it up, Jim, what was the ethos? What was the aim of the company?
Well, it was 19, by the time we finally had the idea of actually publishing a songbook, because that wasn't the original idea. I was, before we even thought about publishing songbooks, I just became infatuated with the instrument, principally as a songwriter.
Right.
I'd always loved writing songs. And in fact, I was a musical theater major in college. And that's when I really discovered sort of the really tight, the songwriting of the classic songwriters. It's often referred to as the Great American Songbook over here. That's the music that was written by, Irving Berlin and then all of the great writers like Johnny Mercer and Richard Rodgers and the Gershwins and Jerome Kern and all of these beautifully constructed songs. And then also, as I said, the songs that were written for Broadway. And as much as we talk about sound, ukulele carries a certain amount of baggage, at least it did in 1991, that the guitar also was seen very much as a folk pop instrument. And I was really getting into writing songs that had one foot definitely in Tin Pan Alley and these kind of classic American song structures. And so suddenly this instrument with 4 strings, even though it was sort of limiting in a sense in terms of the pretty chords that I could play. I was losing 1/3 of my chordal options by going from the guitar to the uke. In some ways, it seemed to open up, oddly enough, the harmonic opportunities, especially on this Martin tenor. And I should say, I think I stumbled early on into, way before I'd ever met him, into Lyle Ritz tuning, which was DGBE with a high D. I think it just simply made sense to me. So I did keep the reentrant tuning, but it was the lower guitar tuning, which I was used to. And I just started writing songs on this instrument, and I just fell in love with it. Then we found we went to an old music store in LA that had been sitting on a pile of old ukulele songbooks from the 50s, the last time the uke had been popular. And we bought them all. And because Liz had grown up with this TV program over here called Lawrence Welk, the Lawrence Welk Show, which was a show that was very popular in the 60s, that featured this conductor who played very much these old-fashioned songs. She had this encyclopedic knowledge of all of these old tunes. And when we were going through these songbooks, she was just singing them and I was playing them, and surprised at the sophistication of these pretty chords in these old songbooks. And I fell in love with it so much that I thought, gee, I wonder if there's any market for a book that would feature some of these old arrangements, which obviously are not available now. All of these books that we bought at the time were way out of print, and in early 1992, if you went to a decent LA-based music store and you looked in the ukulele section, there was usually one book or no book, and the one book was Mel Bay's How to Play the Ukulele book with Mel in a suit and tie, from the 60s. So it was just some ancient book because there was nothing for the instrument. And so on a whim, we thought, what if we could just pull together some of the best arrangements from these books and put out a book and see what happened? And that's what we did.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very glad you did. I had Mel Bay's Learn the Banjo book as well. I still have it somewhere. So fantastic. What a great way to start a company. You then moved on. I know you did the visual history as well, which, that was in 97, wasn't it, that you did that? And you then moved into publishing other people. And a book that I really want to talk about is the John King book. So many things amaze me about this book, Jim. Firstly, that you did it in 2004. No one else was doing this. And I would love to ask you, firstly, were you crazy? Did you think that that's going to sell well? Because I hold this book in high esteem. I think it kick-started the whole, if you want to call it, revolution of classical music on the ukulele. I think several people, including myself, owe their career to it, because if this hadn't paved the way, we certainly wouldn't be doing books like this. And I wanted to also ask you how you came to work with John.
Well, let's see. I have so many wonderful memories of John. But, going back to your original question, and this will feed right into this question about sort of the ethos. And this will lead to something I know you want to talk about later too, which is Lyle Ritz. So this didn't happen right away, but I will say, to sort of tease what we'll discuss later, that early on somebody, and this was well before John King or meeting Lyle, somebody, when we were in Hawaii visiting, somebody gave me a tip, and they said, go find the album How About Uke by Lyle Ritz. So this was after we had published maybe one or two songbooks, and I heard Lyle Ritz. And yes, right. And although this was 1992, and actually in LA, there were still stores that specialized in old vinyl, and I tracked down the original vinyl record, the original Verve release that he did in 1958 or something. And literally, when I put that on the record player and listened to the first song, that changed everything. And so I in turn give Lyle all the credit for why we became what we became, because until I heard that record, we thought, let's do a book just for fun. I had a good job at Billboard, and Liz was doing graphic design for movies. And so we had pretty good careers, and we weren't looking for something else to do. And then I heard Lyle playing these extraordinary tunes in a jazz setting, and it just blew me away. And I thought, oh my God, I bet very, very few people have any idea that the ukulele can play in this neighborhood. And I thought to myself, this is an incredibly misunderstood instrument. It's mostly thought of as a Hawaiian instrument and something that's kind of lighthearted and fun and not serious. And so I thought, gee, if there's anything that we can do to help rebrand the instrument, at least for people outside of Hawaii. Certainly people in Hawaii knew what it was capable of, but for most people on the mainland in the US, it was just considered something sort of toy-like. And so immediately after hearing Lyle's record, I thought we need to see where we can take this instrument. So already the idea of publishing books that would push the envelope was on my mind. And so when we did finally meet John, because John was on the circuit, when we were on the circuit playing concerts, there was a group called the Ukulele Hall of Fame Museum that was doing annual festivals in the early days. And we ran into John then and became friends. And then when you heard John perform live, it was like, oh my God, this is, I mean, talk about, expanding the envelope. You'd never heard anything like it. And he was playing in that campanella style. And so by the time that I finally said to John, would you be willing to do a book for us? We'd already done a book with Lyle and done a book with Herb Oda. And so it was very easy to ask him at that point. It was just a question of him saying yes, and he was thrilled to do it.
Yeah, fantastic. Because the fascinating thing about John's style is, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was raised in Hawaii, wasn't he? I believe
he was. And that John was. He also co-wrote the book. I think the definitive book on the history of the ukulele with Jim Tranquata. And so the other thing about John that was so important to me was that John knew the history of the instrument way better than anybody else. And so I deferred to him when we did the reprint of my book on the history of the ukulele, and had him, kind of check me for details and facts. And so he fact checked the book. So he was really a 2-for-1. John was not only the finest classical ukulele player in the world, absolutely, certainly at the time, and then on top of it, he knew more about the history of the instrument than anybody else did.
I'm rereading his book at the moment. I've read it. I've read it before, and it is a great read. I'm rereading it. There's a fantastic player that we have in the UK called Sam Muir, a wonderful Samantha Muir classical player. I did an interview with her recently, and funny enough, a question that you and I will come to, I said, if you could meet anyone, past or present, and spend time with them, who would it be? And she said, John. She said, I would love to ask him about his campanella style and that, because what I was going to say was he was raised in Hawaii, but his style, I guess, do you think that came from his classical guitar? Because he's not a thumb player. He's using all his 4 fingers. He used his nails, etc. Do you think that came from his classical guitar background?
Yeah, I wish I could give you more details about his playing philosophy, but there's no question. I mean, I believe he taught classical guitar at Eckerd College in Florida. So, and also that he also studied guitar. I think all the time I knew him, he had a regular, he had a very fine guitarist teacher who he was continuing to study with. So he was deeply invested in classical guitar, in the literature, in the playing. And at the same time, he's diving in to the history of the ukulele, and also in touch with folks in Madeira as well.
Yeah.
And looking deeply into some of the literature for the machete and Briguinha. And so exploring some of those original, Portuguese, Madeiran folk songs and the techniques. So I remember that even in those days when he was performing a lot, I think that in his repertoire, he would play pieces that were from Madeira and folk tunes from Madeira, and he would echo some of the styles. So as well as also some of the wonderful sort of classical pieces that were written by, I think it's Kai in Hawaii. He was also exploring all of the, kind of classical-ish pieces that had been written by the great Hawaiian virtuosos too.
Yeah, his book's very interesting because although it's titled Classical Uke, yeah, it has a lot of Hawaiian pieces in it as well. Um, I'd love to know John's reaction. I mean, it's so sad that he passed away. I'd love to know how, I'm sure he'd be very proud that the book still sells well, still talked about, still very influential, and that some of the best players in the world today are saying if they could meet anyone, it would be John. It's a fitting history for a wonderful player, and I'm sure a wonderful, wonderful man. Thank you for talking about John. Moving on to Lyle as well. I'm a massive Lyle fan. When I, like you, when I first heard Lyle's, well, for me, it was the CD. I have three of his. I have the one the double one.
Right.
It just blew me away. And I still listen to that album and find new things in it every time I listen to it. Lyle's style, that rolls off the tongue. Lyle's style, very, very different to John. Very, very much more, I would say, Hawaiian style. And he does this whole chord melody thing. The stretches that he could do were just incredible. Now, you've written a fair bit with Lyle, certainly on the Bossa Nova one. You wrote the first and the last ones. It doesn't get better than that, the first and the last ones, doesn't it? A Moment Later and Old in New Mexico. I'd love to hear how you wrote with Lyle. If we could talk about that, Jim. Did he come to you with a musical idea and you then came up with the lyrics, or you sat together and did it? I'd love to hear about that process, Jim.
It's not all that interesting the way we wrote. It ended up that because at the time, Lyle, makes a little bit of sense to just review our relationship, because we do finally meet Lyle, and at the time he's living in Hawaii, and I could talk about Lyle forever. One of the most interesting things about Lyle, of course, is that he was best known as a bass player.
Sure.
So it's important that your audience know that he was famous within the world of LA musicians and recorded music as the acoustic bass player in particular. In the Wrecking Crew, which was the LA-based studio group. And he played on Good Vibrations and Pet Sounds. And I think they used to say, all of them, they used to say they played on approximately 5,000 records.
I read that.
So that's how he made his living. And then he retired with his wife and daughter to Hawaii. And he ended up, sort of gigging over there, and I tracked him down, and it was the start of a grand friendship. And early on, I was such a fan of his playing that I asked him, would you be willing to do a songbook for us? And so when you talk about the John King book, actually the model for that started with Lyle. We did the first sort of 9x12 book with a CD with Lyle, and it was called Lyle Ritz Jazz. Yeah. And it was the idea of finally sharing some of his beautiful chording on all standard tunes. And you can hear him on the CD as well. And then we ended up doing three books with him. At the same time, we also became really close friends with Herb Oda, Ota-san, not to be confused with Junior, his son, who's also a marvelous, marvelous player. But his father was a legend and is a legend. Still very much alive, and one of the interesting things about, and I will get back to Lyle, but it kind of leads to Lyle and songwriting, is that it turned out that on every one of Herb's, gosh, he must be up to 80 or so albums that he's made over the course of his career, he always put in a couple of originals, and I was really quite taken with his writing. And I asked him at one point, would you be willing to collaborate? And he didn't really, lyric writing wasn't his strength. And so he said, sure. And so that then began this years-long collaboration, long-distance collaboration with Herb, where we've written at this point about 50 songs and recorded a number of them. I did a whole album called The Finer Things of songs that I wrote with Herb, where he wrote the music, I wrote the lyrics, and a number of those songs have been covered by other people. I'm doing a new album of songs that'll include 2 songs that I wrote with Herb. And so as I'm writing with Herb, I'd get together with Lyle in Hawaii, or then eventually he moves to Oregon. And I knew that Lyle had written tunes too, not nearly as many as Herb, but that he had done a little bit of soundtrack work when he was with the Wrecking Crew. And I heard a few of his original tunes, and they were incredibly interesting and charming. And I just encouraged him. I said, I'd love to write with you. And so eventually, it wasn't as easy with Herb. Herb was like a faucet. He would sometimes send me tapes with 5 or 6 songs on them at a time, and I'd get them weekly. I mean, he was just pouring melodies. Lyle was not that way, but every once in a while I'd get a tape with a couple of songs on it. And it was the same thing pretty much. I got a tune and then I wrote lyrics to it. And I really enjoyed that process during those years especially. I sort of thought of Johnny Mercer has been a huge influence in my life. He did write a few tunes himself as well, but mostly as a lyric writer, like on Moon River, yeah, which I think of as being a masterpiece, and then just hundreds and hundreds of other standards. So I was really trying to sort of get into that Johnny Mercer zone, especially with Herb and Lyle, who were writing really classically constructed tunes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Just to jump back, did John and Lyle ever meet?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Everybody was getting, there wasn't as much, in the early days, I've been doing this a long time, like 30 years. It's hard to believe. But in the early days, there were only a few festivals happening, often on the East Coast. And so because there were only a few happening, everybody came from everywhere. I mean, you'd come to some of the early fests and there would be people coming from Europe. Even the early New York Uke Fest, the very first one, as I recall, there were tons of folks from England and Europe who came because it just hadn't, the whole Uke Fest thing in Europe hadn't really begun yet.
Yeah. Wow.
So just as a result, then Lyle would be invited to these fests to play, and John King would be invited. So there was a tight group of people who were sort of performing at all these things, and so yes, everybody met each other.
What a memory seeing those two play together. Wow. I'd give up my ukulele collection to see that, Jim. Thank you. And unfortunately, we don't have forever. So I wanted to move on. Something that really I want to talk about, Jim, is your work in instrumental music on the ukulele. Now, I've had the pleasure of working with Tony Mizen recently, and we did a concert, and we were playing duets, but we both did a couple of solo bits, and he said, I'm going to play this Dovetail by Jim, and he'd played me a couple of snippets of it anyway. It's a wonderful piece. The thing I said to you earlier, what I love about it is it starts very dark, and then without a key change, I believe, becomes quite light and airy, and it's a wonderful piece. And Tony, of course, did it justice when he played it. It would have been lovely for you to see it. I just wondered if you could tell me, when you were writing that bit of music, what your aims were, and was it written on a ukulele, or do you write on something else and then move it over onto a ukulele? What's your process there, Jim?
Well, thanks so much for asking. Yeah, this has been a whole new unexpected chapter for me. I've written 2 concertos. Both of them were commissioned by an orchestra here in Connecticut called the Wallingford Symphony Orchestra. And the Dovetail was debuted just a few years ago. The first one, You Can't Be Serious, debuted way back in 1999. So that's been around a while. But the Dovetail was inspired by, actually, where we live in Connecticut, there are a lot of birds. It's almost like a bird sanctuary where we are. And in particular, and so of course, you hear bird calls constantly. And then all of a sudden I became really fascinated with the bird call of a bird known as the mourning dove, which to me was one of the most musical calls I've still ever heard. And I thought, I wonder if I could musicalize that. So that's how it started. And that's what gives it its opening sort of theme. That is my effort to try to musicalize the mourning dove call. And if you look it up online, you'll see how close I got to it. And then I just simply constructed this idea of telling the story about a lonely mourning dove who is seeking a partner. And so that's really all you need to know about the story behind the song. He's a lonely mourning dove in the beginning, and it has a happy ending.
Well, it certainly went down well when Tony played it, and I was listening to it last night. It's available on Spotify, actually, not with Tony playing it, with someone else playing it. As is your album, with potentially the best name for an album ever, Jim's Dog's Got Fleas, which is a great album. And I read on that you play a Martin tenor. Is this the original Martin tenor?
It was, yeah.
And a national as well, soprano, I believe you played. So I'm guessing that's steel string, is it?
No. Nationals. Oh gosh, you never put steel strings on nationals. They were always meant for nylons. Yeah, no, I think I used it on. Gosh, that goes back way back. But it was mostly the Martin tenor.
Right.
That I played on that original record. Yeah, and it still sort of holds up.
Definitely. I was listening to it last night and enjoying it greatly. So, going back to Flea Market Music, we're jumping around a bit here. What are the plans sort of at the moment for that, and what are you as an individual working on?
Yeah, well, Liz and I always had this line where we said, well, we could always do Jumpin' Jim's ukulele polkas. And really what that was shorthand for was we had sort of checked off a lot of boxes. We were I think the first to do a book with a lot of Beatles songs in it, and that was the 60s Ukin book, and George Harrison wrote the foreword to that, which was an amazing experience. And then, we got to do, really the first series of jazz books with Lyle Ritz, and we got to do the first classical book with John. We did the first, as far as I know, the blues book with Fred Sokolow, and bluegrass with Fred. And then when we hooked up with Tony Mizen, which was just a delight and completely unplanned and unexpected, Tony just contacted us by email, and he said, "What about a book of lute literature for the ukulele?" Yeah. And I think Liz and I looked at each other and said, well, we could probably sell about 4 copies of that. And then I said, well, Tony, send us an example. And what he sent was so charming, so beautiful, that we thought, well, who cares if we only sell 4 copies? It's worthy. And so I'm thrilled to say that all of Tony's 3 books, he went from the lute book to the Baroque book, and then finally one that always blows me away, that he was able to take Debussy and Chopin and reduce them. I mean, that's really the genius, is to take these very thick, lush chords, or these very, very sophisticated arrangements, and reduce them to just 4 strings, and yet maintain enough of the DNA of the original composition that it's satisfying. So all of those books sell really well. And so we've sort of checked off a lot of boxes. We never did do a polka book, but and then in 2010, I really had this feeling that there was a need, especially over here with all the ukulele clubs, that there was a need for one big book at least of songs for sort of a wide range of players. And because we were witnessing this phenomenon of especially sort of semi-retired and retired folks who were gathering to play songs and sing them together. And so that was the birth of the Daily Ukulele, and eventually that had a spin-off with the Leap Year edition, and then we did baritone versions and even a portable version. And so I think we sort of feel like we never say never, but at this point, I'm really focused on songwriting, and so my latest project right now, even under lockdown situations before the virus, I had fortunately locally recorded the uke parts and the vocals for a whole brand new album of material, and then once the lockdown hit, I thought, well, it's just going to all go into hibernation. And then it dawned on me that I know all these wonderful musicians all over. And so I started sending them tracks. And so it's been really remarkable to watch this thing come to life with all these other musicians who are under lockdown, and they've got some recording equipment. And so all of these songs are very much alive and being added to. And, you know, hopefully in the not too distant future, it will be done and we'll do a final mix and put it out.
Fantastic. I really look forward to that. Does it have a working title?
Yes, it's called The Wind and Sun, and there's a song with that title on the record, and it's one of my very favorite Aesop's fables.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I really, really look forward to that. Now, a question that I wanted to ask you that I ask a lot of people, Jim. If you could go anywhere on a journey, who would it be with? Where would you go? And what would you listen to?
Yeah, this is a good one. You know, I should probably just, as a brief little intro, I should say that, you know, I draw from, am inspired constantly and influenced by a whole pantheon of musicians, like I'm sure everyone who watches your program, and you and so many others. So my pantheon are not too surprising. It's starting with, you know, Jerome Kern and Hoagie Carmichael and Johnny Mercer, and then more modern contemporary artists like James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, Stevie Wonder, Jimmy Webb, Todd Rundgren. I'm a huge Todd Rundgren fan. Rufus Wainwright. But I'll tell you who my latest obsession is, and he's close to home over there. Right now, I'm just completely swept away by the talent of Jacob Collier.
Right. Okay.
So if you're not familiar with Jacob Collier, you really need to check him out. He's 25. He actually does play the ukulele, but that's really the smallest of his accomplishments. He's just a phenom in every sense of the word. He plays every instrument pretty much peerlessly. He writes, but he does. He has innovated in ways, in terms of both the way he records and the way he does videos, in ways that it's beyond me even to describe, except to tell anybody who is unfamiliar with his work, check out, for example, his version of Moon River.
Okay.
That features something like, you know, 300 or 500 of his voices all coming together. He multi-tracks like nobody. And also he has a sense and understanding of the mechanics of music that is also sort of off the charts. So he is a force to be reckoned with, and I'm really in awe of him. And I will say that I learned about Jacob. One of the last things I learned from Lyle Ritz before he passed away was that Lyle had been turned on to Jacob Collier. And that's how, and Lyle was a huge fan of close harmony. In fact, Lyle toured with a group called the Hi-Los at one point in his career. And the Hi-Los were this extraordinary quartet of tight harmony singers. And so Lyle always, and you can think about that when you listen to some of Lyle's arrangements, it's all about this tight, beautiful chordal harmony. And so there's no surprise that when somebody must have tipped him off about Jacob's videos and this tight harmony. And then I heard about it through Lyle, and now I've become a huge Jacob Collier fan.
Fantastic. And where would you go?
I'd go anywhere. I'd go anywhere. And you know, I think I'd probably let him bring the record collection and just anything he wanted to play. Fantastic.
Well, I think potentially Zoom will cut us off in a minute. So what I'll do, Jim, I'm just going to sort of round up. I mean, firstly, I want to thank you for your time. Secondly, I want to thank you for everything that your company has done. I often wonder if people such as yourself, Jim, know how much you've achieved. You know, you've done some fantastic work, and I think the ukulele today wouldn't be where it is without you. I'm a massive fan of your books, the people you've worked with, yourself as well. I admire you so much for what you did, you know, bringing Lyle, you know, bringing this stuff out of Lars, bringing stuff out of John's, your own stuff as well. I'm very grateful. It certainly enriched my life, and I'm sure a lot lot of people's as well. If I go through my drawer over there, I've got all of Lyle's books. So it's fantastic, and it's been so kind of you to sit with me and talk with me. Many people are going to find this very, very interesting, and I'm sure there's a whole queue of people behind me who would like to thank you. So I thank you for your time, for everything that you've done, and I wish you all the best for the future. So if you want to sort of say something to end, I'll then stop recording, then we can have a chat afterwards if you want.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, thanks so much for inviting me to join your series. It's been my pleasure. And look, hey, we're all home, so
Yeah.
so it's lovely to do this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. Let me just press stop recording.